Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Harvard Business School Association of Thailand's virtual talk today. My name is Jan, an MBA class of 2007 and a board member of the association. HBS ATS provides a stage for idea exchange on various business issues, led by our association's president, Ultimatums. Today, we're going to learn about negotiation, strategy, and diplomacy lessons from Professor Deepak Malhotra and his book, The Peacemakers Code. Thank you, Professor Deepak, very much for joining us today. We're all very excited. The session will be moderated by Kun Adisorn, who is an OPM 51 and also a board member of the association. Without further ado, please welcome our association's president, Kun Ultimatums, for the opening remarks.
Greetings to all the participants of today's webinar, aptly named the Peacemakers Code. I understand the participants tune in from around the globe, and I'm very glad. I'm very glad that we have a world audience here for a very interesting presentation today. Harvard Business School Association of Thailand is in its 8th year of existence. It aims to be a platform for exchange of know-how, the art and science of management. From time to time, we bring together thinkers, innovators, practitioners, the people who know what they're doing, and enlighten us about what they have found. We would bring in all the participants now to this the presentation. Today is the speaker today, Professor Deepak Malhotra, is arguably one of the most celebrated business professors in the world today, and evidently the pride of the Harvard Business School. I will let Kun Janissa introduce the professor in detail.
Professor is the Professor of Business Administration at HBS. Amongst his many accomplishments includes that he is an advisor to all CEOs around the globe and to the government as well. In 2020, he was named Business School Professor of the Year. He has won numerous awards for his teaching and research. In 2014, he was listed as one of the world's best business school professor under the age of 40. In 2020, Professor Deepak also launched a new course at Harvard entitled War and Peace: The Lessons of History for Strategy, Leadership, Negotiation, Policy, and Humanity. With these, I'm sure everyone is ready to hear from you, Professor. Over to you, Professor Deepak. Thank you.
Waiting, I just want to say that it's 7:30 in the morning in Boston, and that's where the professor is. So he has gotten up very early for this session. Thank you very much, Professor.
Well, you're very welcome, but I am delighted to be here. So it was really no trouble at all.
I think without further ado, we can start the session now. First of all, I'm very excited to moderate this, as Deepak is one of my favorite professors at Harvard, and we all enjoyed his class tremendously. Prior to this, I was discussing about what we learned, and there's so much technical terms, and I want to use some here, but then Deepak suggested that in the interest of time and crushing this in an hour, if I were to give you some of the negotiation jargon, like what is a ZOPA or BATNA and all, people would really be in the confusion of what we are talking about, except for those who have taken the class with him. So I've decided not to do that, but just pick his brain on his favorite subject and topic, which is negotiation, conflict resolution, and to that tune. Also, I would like to say, to give a shout out to many of my OPM 51s. I'm very happy. I think they're signing in from all around the world. America, continent, Europe. So today we're gonna do it in 3 parts within an hour. The first, we're going to focus on negotiation strategy, techniques, the what's and whatnots, the do's and the don'ts. Second part, we're going to talk about Deepak's novel, The Peacemaker Code, which is just hot off the print. It's available on Amazon, and we'll post a link for you to be able to part we will leave it. So if you have any questions, you can also look at the question and we'll try to group the questions that are similar in nature together, and then we can ask Deepak and he can share his view. So Deepak, I would just like to dive in right away. Some of the skills and characteristics that make someone a great negotiator.
Well, thank you, Ricky. Before I jump into the first question you've asked, let me just first start by thanking everybody for being here. I know everybody's taking time out from something else that they could be doing, so I'm honored for you to be taking some of your time out from the day and spending it with us. I also want to thank the HBS Association of Thailand and the other Harvard clubs that have come together to host this event. And to you, Ricky and Bantun and Jan for moderating and getting us going. So thanks to all of you for doing this. And with that, I'll just jump right into your question. So, what makes somebody an effective negotiator? There's a lot of traits. There's a lot of things that people do. Often the question is, are you born a great negotiator, or can you become a great negotiator? And in the world that I live in, which is as an academic who studies and teaches negotiation, and as somebody who advises and consults on deals, I typically focus on those things that we can actually change about people. So if there was no way to become a better negotiator, if there was no way to become more effective at negotiation, well, we should probably stop doing what we're doing, both at Harvard Business School in the negotiation courses, but also when we're advising people in the middle of deals. So when we think about it from the perspective of what makes somebody an effective negotiator that you can actually change, I think there's a handful of things that come to mind that are particularly important to keep in mind as you enter negotiations. For example, one of the things that effective negotiators do better than ineffective negotiators is that they're much more investigative. They walk into a negotiation with a learning mindset. Too often we think of negotiation as an opportunity to go in and convince people to do certain things. And certainly that's a part of negotiation. But I think effective negotiators walk in first and foremost with a learning mindset. You are there above all else to learn as much as you can about the interests, the constraints, the perspective of all the parties that are relevant to the negotiation. Which leads us to the second thing that effective negotiators, I think, do, which is that they think much more broadly about the negotiation, and they don't focus simply on the people who happen to show up in the room, not just the people that are sitting across the table from you. Effective negotiators think about who are all the parties that are relevant to this deal or this dispute, all the parties that can influence a negotiation or are influenced by the negotiation. And so when you're strategizing, you need to be thinking about all these parties. And the third thing I'll mention, and again, we could go on, but the third thing I'll mention, which I think is very important, is effective negotiators think not just about the substance of the deal. What are the things that we need to give and take? What are the concessions that need to be made? What are the deal terms? Effective negotiators also pay a lot of attention to process. How are we going to get from where we are today to the finish line? And the finish line might be a signed deal. It might be the implementation of a deal. But what are all the things that need to happen between now and then, apart from the give and take that will take place in the negotiation? So when you have these sorts of emphases in your approach to negotiation, thinking about the other side's perspective, having a learning mindset, thinking about all the parties that are relevant, and thinking about process, now you're much more likely to achieve those goals that you walked in to achieve in the first place.
All right. I mean, I hear like some techniques, and also I think I detect a bit of the value creation. But before we get into the value creation, what are the common mistakes that people take it in? I mean, you talk about you're trying to convince, but it's not all about that. So what are the common mistakes that people make when they enter into the negotiation?
Yeah, often the mistakes people make in negotiation, I think it would be unfair to say that people do things that are just completely stupid or dumb in a negotiation. Most of the time, people do things in a negotiation that are ineffective or that don't work out or that are mistakes are because they're thinking about something that probably makes sense to do, but they're not balancing all of the things that they need to be doing. So somebody who comes in and is aggressive, that can work, but it doesn't work in every situation. Somebody who walks in and tries to persuade the other side, but hasn't laid the foundation of building a bit of a relationship there or building trust there may be ineffective. So typically what we see happening in negotiations where people are making mistakes, they're not doing something that is universally a bad idea. What they're doing is something that probably has either worked in the past or worked with other people or is an element of an effective strategy. So they're not completely off base, but they haven't either laid the foundation or balanced the other things that they need to be doing in a negotiation. So as an effective negotiator, you want to make sure that if you are, and the mistake can be in either direction. If you are very nice and you're a good listener and you ask a lot of questions, that's wonderful. But at some point, you also have to advocate for yourself. So you can't be too far on one side. If all you're doing is advocating for yourself and you're not doing enough listening or paying attention to what drives the interests of the other side, well, that would be a mistake as well, right? If you're being very, very aggressive, there are times in negotiations, in disputes, when the only way you can get the other side to take you seriously, or the only way you can get them to sit down at the table with you, is by flexing a little bit of muscle. But if all you're doing is flexing muscle and not transitioning into a way forward for both sides, well, that can also be a mistake. So often the mistake is not balancing all of the things you need to be doing and focusing too narrowly on one or two skills.
So how much time should you spend on building trust? I mean, then there's of course, sometimes there's a time limit to the negotiation. If you enter the room for the first time and you need to get this done, there's not enough time. So what is your advice there?
Yeah, so even the way you phrase the question, I think is really sort of interesting and important. The idea of how much time should you spend on trust somewhat presumes that it's really a choice. But I think most people on this webinar would appreciate the other aspect of what you said, which is, but you don't always have that choice. It's not like, well, do I want to spend a little bit of time or do I want to spend 6 months to a year building trust before I do? No, the deal needs to be done or the conflict needs to be resolved today, or at least it needs to be addressed today. So the way I think about trust building is in a few different sort of layers. First, don't think of it as a sequential thing where I'm going to build trust. Trust is there, then we will start doing the negotiation in full force. These things are going to be happening continuously. In fact, most of the times people lose the trust of the other party is during the negotiation because of the way they behave. And it's often small things. And this is the next thing I want to bring up, which is in relationships that we have in our lives with family and close friends and the people we work with over a long period of time and longer relationships, that trust is much more deep-seated and takes a long time to build. But there's a lot of people Ricky, and a lot of people I know that I don't know that well, but I could still rate them on, does this person seem trustworthy or not? There's people that you don't know super well, but you somehow still make those judgments. And the reason we make those judgments about people is because even in sort of micro environments and in small interactions, we pick up cues about whether somebody is trustworthy or not. And in negotiation, a very common cue that people take is, does this person usually say what they mean and follow up on what they say? So for example, if the other side doesn't trust you, you have to ask yourself, is it because in the past when I said things like, hey, I really need this, it turned out I didn't really need this? Or when I drew a red line and I said, we must have this, otherwise we can't do the deal. And when the times changed, I sort of relaxed that constraint. And so what people often will catalog about you are things related to whether you're being honest, whether you're being open and transparent to the extent that is reasonable in that negotiation. Nobody expects you to be a completely open book in a contentious negotiation. Nobody expects you to reveal all the things that you know. but they do walk in with a certain script, a certain schema about how things are likely to unfold in this relationship. Even with a stranger, there's a script or a schema we walk in with, thinking they should be at least this open. They should be at least this honest. They should stick to what they said earlier at least this often. And if you're breaking those expectations, you're losing trust. So the way I think about it is always be honest. That doesn't mean you have to reveal everything. They don't expect you to reveal everything, but you have to be honest. If you say something, you stick with it. And going back to what effective negotiators do, I would say one of the things that really great negotiators are mindful of, and I'm thinking here about diplomats that I respect, business people that I respect, the best negotiators I know will guard their credibility with their life. And I think the reason that is because if you've been out there long enough and you've had to deal with really difficult negotiations or really important negotiations, one of the things you come to appreciate is that there will come times when the only leverage you have in a negotiation is your credibility. The only reason the other person will sit down with you or take the risk you're asking them to take or move in the direction you're suggesting they move is because they trust you and because they think you're credible. There's nothing else that you have on that day other than your reputation. And on those days, especially, you'll be glad that you didn't let that credibility or that reputation sort of drift away simply because you were trying to make a buck.
So if you say that you're going to do something, you promise something, you're creating trust, and you can't deliver it, how best do you restore this and make sure that you regain that? I mean, there's something you can't review and something you can. And you might not be able to get your side of the bargain because of something you can't share with your opposite party. How do you restore this?
Yeah, so you have to own it. But before you own the mistake that you made, let's make sure we are not too easily making promises, or giving assurances, or saying we're going to do certain things because in that moment it seems like the right thing to say, or the easy thing to say because it helps move things forward, or it gives you what you want. So what I'm going to say here is going to answer your question about, well, what do you do if you can't follow through? But I would hate for somebody to say, oh, so there's a way out, so then I can say whatever I want because there's always a way out. No, I think these things cumulatively can be problematic if this is happening too often. So if you keep a high bar for yourself, which is you only give assurances when you really think not only that you want to follow through, but you can follow through. When you set the bar high, the number of times you're going to have to sort of make that mistake is going to be limited. But let's say you can help it. You had good intentions, you had every reason and desire to follow through, but you just can't follow through on what you said. I think that's where you have to own it. You need to not make excuses. You need to explain what happened. And often this is true not just when you make a mistake. Explaining what you did and why you did it is generally a good idea in negotiations. So one of the things I often tell negotiators, and if you took a class with me, you would have heard it probably on day one, which is when you make an offer, don't let your offer speak for itself. Tell the story that goes with it. Justify it. Frame it. The same logic is relevant when you're trying to explain why you didn't do something, or why you did something, or why you fell short, or why you made a mistake, or why you can't follow through on a commitment you made. Just telling somebody you can't do it is not enough. Blaming other people in a way that probably won't be credible to them may not work either. So explaining exactly what happened so that they can see the line from why you said you would do it on day one to why you are now on day 10 unable to do it. If you can explain that story to them and offer to make amends, right? You can also offer to make some concessions or some other way of providing value to them. Now you're on better footing for moving forward with that relationship in a strong enough way. And I can tell you from personal experience, there are times where things having gone wrong are a stronger basis for a relationship than things having gone right. Because what people are often judging you for is how did you handle it when things didn't go well? When Ricky, if you and I never have any problems, yeah, I'll trust you. I like you. Yeah, that's great. But I don't have any good test of how trustworthy you are or how much I can put my faith in you until something actually goes wrong. And that gives me a lot more information about you because I now get to see how you handle things in those situations. So when things go bad, think of it also as an opportunity to really put your best foot forward so that you can have maybe even a stronger relationship than you would have had if nothing had gone wrong.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great point. So I said I was going to come back to about the value creation, and I think this is really important because in a negotiation, sometimes it's one side takes all, the other side takes none, or one side takes more, the other side takes less, and we've seen this in a lot of lessons and classes that we did with you. But I think one of the vital things that you left out at the end is about value creation. Can you talk more about this and maybe give a specific example?
Yeah. So, when people hear, not somebody who's maybe taken the whole course and sort of been on the journey, but somebody who's been in business for a long time, in an environment that's very competitive, where, you really just got to grind it out to just, make the money that you're making or to solve the problem you're trying to solve. When they hear words like, well, you should focus on value creation or you should, and sort of a more fuzzy word like win-win, sometimes people will roll their eyes. And I understand why that is, because the immediate reaction is, well, you obviously don't understand how it works in my world, because these ideas of value creation and win-win and everybody walks away, that's just not how the real world works. So I completely appreciate, understand, respect that reaction. But part of that reaction, I think, is driven by their understanding of their reality, but also partly because when we use terms like value creation and win-win, we don't necessarily convey exactly what we mean. So it's useful to sort of clarify this. I don't think you need to walk into a negotiation caring about the outcomes of the other side in order to want to have a value-creating negotiation. You can be completely selfish. You can be only in it for yourself. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but you can be completely selfish and still want to create as much value as you can in the negotiation. You should still want to care a lot about the interests of the other side. You should care about how they're going to take this deal and celebrate it. And the reason is because in negotiations, often the only way to get what you want is to make sure that they're getting some or a lot of what they want. The more value you create in a deal, the more likely you end up with a piece of it. The more easy you make it for the other side to go back and declare victory, the more likely that the people they need to convince will sign off on it. So when you understand that symbiosis, when you understand that relationship that exists in a negotiation, you are in a negotiation because more than you need to agree to what it is that you're doing. Yes, sometimes you have enough leverage and power to just force a deal. But even in situations like that, thinking about how you can create more value is a good thing to do because, again, the more interest that you are reconciling and the more interest that you are meeting and needs that you're meeting and the more value you're creating, the more likely you can monetize that value. So when you create more value in the deal, when you make it so that the other side is also benefiting, well, now they have more opportunity to give concessions to you. If they're walking away with $100 worth of value, the most they can pay you for that is $99. If they're walking away with $10,000 worth of value, now they can pay you $9,999 for that, right, on the limit. So thinking about it from that point of view, I think is a useful thing to do. And then when we talk about it in our course and when we write books on negotiation, we talk a lot about the sort of the tactics of how you get there.
Okay, and now with the COVID situation, I think you've already mentioned sometimes it's not just the person across the table from you. It's not the one in the negotiation room. It's everybody else. It's those who are involved, those who are relevant. But come back to this, like talking about one of your book, Negotiation Genius, it says to achieve brilliant results at the bargaining table. But that table is not there anymore in times of COVID. We are now talking on the screen, and the meeting I had this afternoon, even the screen is not on. I cannot see the face of who I'm talking to. I mean, I know some of them. I don't know some of them, but how has things changes? I mean, and how can we handle this?
Yeah. So, perhaps we should start by counting our blessings. I mean, if this pandemic had taken place 30 years ago and there was no Zoom, then we'd be complaining that there isn't even Zoom. We're on telephones and fax machines. And so, even before the pandemic, people in the business community and anybody who has to negotiate really was always doing it on multiple tracks. Even if you're a salesperson and your goal always is to get in front of the customer and really spend time with them. And there were still phone calls that were being made. There was still email that was doing some of the work. Yes, there was face-to-face, but there was other modes of communication we were always toggling between, because not every single interaction requires face-to-face and sitting down and a lengthy conversation where you're really just sort of doing that. So I myself had to transition, right? So I do negotiation consulting for companies and for CEOs. I do training for companies. When we suddenly switch from being in a room together to being on Zoom with some people coming in and out visually, it is a decrement, right? So I would always say that if I'm going to do a consulting or an advisory role with somebody, day one, I want to spend with them face to face. I want to be in their office with them and their team, and we're going to spend the first day or half day on a strategy session where we really get to sort of rub shoulders with each other. When that got taken away, my guess was that, that's going to drop in sort of effectiveness by like 50%. And I think humans are pretty good at adapting to the environment. And I'd say we're at 90%, 85, 90%. So the way I think about it is, given the options we have, what is the best way to use different modes of communication across the different parts of this process? So for example, I'll give an example specifically about Zoom versus face-to-face and how to adjust for the mistake that we might make. One of the things that happens when we negotiate over Zoom is that people are less comfortable with silence than they would be in a room. See, when you're sitting around and there's 4, 5, 6, 7 people sitting around a table, there'll be moments where you're just like, oh man, we're not getting anywhere. And there'll just be quiet and there'll just be silence and people are just sort of thinking or writing notes and you're giving each other the space. But on Zoom, that doesn't happen. It's very awkward for people to just sit and reflect or just be quiet for a while. And one of the consequences is conversations end up becoming too linear. Somebody is always speaking. Somebody's always responding to what was just said. We're not doing as many departures from the script that we're on right now. People aren't able to really sit back and think about more creative options. So if I'm going to be in a negotiation where I cannot meet face-to-face, and I would have wanted to do so because there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of potential different ways of doing these things, or it's something completely new. We've never done a deal like this before, or it's a new group of people. What I will do is I will create infrastructure around that Zoom call to make that Zoom call more effective. And by infrastructure, I mean things like I might send ideas in advance on email in ways that I might not have done if we were going to do face-to-face. I might, instead of setting up one Zoom call, set up 2 or 3 Zoom calls in advance, knowing that people are going to need some time in between to think through some of the things that come out in the first hour. Whereas in a real face-to-face negotiation, maybe it would have been much easier to handle. Here, it's not going to be, people are not going to be silent enough. They're not going to be able to sort of talk to their team, during a bathroom break as easily. So let's just create infrastructure. So where does a phone call fit in? Where does a follow-up phone call fit in? Where does an email fit in? Where is a check-in? How many Zoom calls should we do? And I think if you are proactive about it and mindful about it, you can get to, if not 100%, but you can get to the 90, 95% with Zoom being one of the options. Incidentally, if somebody's interested, I have this video on negotiating on Zoom. So if you want, you can just sort of Google it. There's a little bit more ideas in there as well. If you just Google my name and negotiating on Zoom, you can find it's like a 10-minute video.
All right. Okay. So, but just a bit more on this. What if you don't get a chance to even see face-to-face? Like what I've just experienced maybe today. I mean, everybody has a camera shot. I don't know if it's a culture thing or it's in the US it doesn't happen, but in Asia it happens a lot. I'm not sure. How do you know the reaction of the
It
other
could also
party.
just be that it just happens with you, Ricky. No, I'm just kidding. But when it happens, right? We have to ask ourselves, well, why is it that the person isn't? Anytime something happens you don't like, any behavior by the other side that you either dislike or find to be ineffective or irrational or any sort of negative thing, the first thing a negotiator does is they ask the question, why might this person be doing it? Because unless you get to that why, you can't then get to what's the solution to it. If the reason is this person has bad Wi-Fi connection, right? They just, listen, they turn on the video and then they can't hear you. So they've gotten used to now just not turning it on. Okay, that's one kind of problem. If they just don't look very nice because they're sort of gotten used to not shaving and not, like putting on their nice clothes or their hair is a mess or some reason. And so that's why they're doing it. Well, maybe you might want to think about, well, what time of the day you're going to want to have this call. If they think that they're going to be at a disadvantage of some kind, right? So you want to see them, you want to gauge them, but they kind of like the idea of some social distance, not social distance the way we mean in the pandemic. Social distance used to just mean sort of like, we don't feel as close because we can't see each other face to face. So if they want social distance because they don't feel as much commitment towards the deal, well, that's a different problem. So as Ricky, who is perhaps not a big fan of people not showing up on the screen, I try to do two things. One, I try to figure out what's exactly the reason. And maybe I even just ask folks, hey, would it be okay to put on the screen? And if they say no, or if they sort of begrudgingly do it, you can sort of try to figure out why it might be. But if not, let's say you don't feel comfortable asking that, or you're not getting very far. Then what I would do is I would say, let me limit the number of times I want or need them to be on the screen so that it's not all or nothing. That the equilibrium sometimes is somebody never turns on their screen or they always turn on their screen. If you need them to turn on their screen once in a while, well, then what you end up doing is, hey, we can just do phone calls. We can do phone calls. Hey, but for this meeting, I think it would be really useful if we got on Zoom and really got to see each other face to face and sort of discuss this. I find it easier to do that, ... And when you put the onus on yourself, I find it easier. This makes it better for me. I would be able to be more effective if we could do that. It would help me. Now, all of a sudden, I think people are more likely to say yes than to just be like, no, too bad. Sorry, Ricky, we're still not going to do it. So if you reduce the ask and you give a justification for it, I think people are just much more likely to do it rather than just follow their own gut instinct.
Okay, so on this topic, you have a link. So I maybe somebody has just posted the link, but to get further information.
See, I mean, this wouldn't happen in real life. So you really gotta appreciate this, Ricky. Think about it. We're talking, people are making comments on this side. They're not in the room. They're able to participate. Somebody puts the link on. This is magic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good side and there's bad side. But since I'm on technology, I want to ask just one more question. You think the AI will be doing the negotiation in the future? It might replace something? Just so we get out there.
Will AI be doing negotiations in the future? It's hard to know. I'll be honest with you. I think anybody who has a very strong opinion on this, you end up being one of those people that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, people quote you and say, look at that idiot. He thought so-and-so. So I don't have too strong an opinion, but I have some thoughts around it. First of all, I think and this is true, it is very hard to predict what AI will be able to do and what its limitations are. I think the limitations are shockingly low, or high, whatever you want to call it. There's almost no limitations. What we'll be able to do in 50 years is going to be potentially unimaginable right now. But you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to negotiate? I think that's the more interesting question, because the way we define negotiation right now is not how do you get a deal on price, or how do you get deal terms in a 3-variable negotiation where you're trying to get a price and a delivery date and some sort of quality assurances and some sort of warrants and exclusivities. If that's what we mean by negotiation, then yes, it's sort of much easier to imagine that a lot of this will become automated. In fact, some of it is already automated, right? There's technologies doing some of this stuff. But that's not what I usually mean when I think of negotiation. When I use the word negotiation, what I'm thinking about is it's not about deal terms. It's not about dollars and cents or any other currency. It's not about, when we're dealing with, I do a lot of work with armed conflict and governments negotiating difficult situations. It's not about lives lost or lives saved. For me, negotiation fundamentally is about human interaction. And the question we are trying to answer and the problem we're trying to solve as negotiators is how do we engage with other people who have a different set of interests than we do, or a different perspective than we do, who have different goals than we do, different constraints than we do. How do we deal with these people who are different from us to achieve better understandings and better agreements? That's it. That's what negotiation is. How do you deal with people with different interests and different perspective and try to find a way forward where you achieve better understandings and better agreements, whether or not that agreement's going to be written down on a piece of paper. So when you think about it that way, will AI really help me reach a better understanding with, my spouse or with my boss? Or will it help, Israelis and Palestinians suddenly of course, that's the right deal. That's not the problem. The problem isn't take an example like that. Take like a really difficult, protracted, seemingly intractable conflict. The problem isn't somebody can't define a deal that in theory both sides should be willing to live with. The question is, how do you deal with issues of identity? How do you deal with issues of trust? How do you deal with issues of grievances? How do you deal with issues of, and then you can go on. So with all humility, I'll say I don't know what AI will be able to do, but there are certain aspects of what we call negotiation that seem a lot easier to achieve. And the other things, maybe it's more likely that AI will facilitate rather than substitute.
Yeah. So, that would also lead me to talk about your sci-fi novel. And in the novel, we know that AI was not really the one who negotiates, but more of like a means to help with the languages. But before I go there, I don't know, you get asked this a lot, but I want like a summary of the do's and don'ts. What's a no-no and what's a must for the negotiation? Your key points.
So it's hard to think at the tactical level. So let me put it this way. There is almost no such thing as never or always when you're talking at the level of tactics, because there's an infinite number of tactics. Tactics are what you say and do. Depending on the situation, I could probably make a case for just about anything that you might say or do. Or I'd be able to find an example where that wouldn't make sense, even though usually it seems like a good idea. So what we need to do a little bit is to get a level above the tactics about what we say and do, to think about the principles that are guiding us, right? So in the always do category, we touched on this, right? So always do involves certainly seeing the perspective of the other side, and empathy, right? So I don't mean sympathy, I mean empathy, really trying to see the world the way they see it. If negotiation is about human interaction and you're dealing with another human being who has some say in what happens next, how can it be that ignoring their perspective is a good idea? So that's a definite do, right? Other things that I've mentioned are always good, but not always as necessary. So when I say zoom out and look at all the parties that are relevant, there's nothing wrong with doing that every time. It's just that it doesn't always make a difference, right? Sometimes the only person that matters is the person across the table from you. So that I would put in the category of, well, yes, why wouldn't you do it? But it's not at the same level as try to understand the perspective of the other side and their interests, right? On the don'ts, again, at the tactical level, you say, well, you probably shouldn't punch the other person in the face. I'd be like, are you sure? I could probably create a scenario where the only way you're going to achieve what you need to achieve is by being that aggressive. So there's no tactical don't evers for the most part, as far as I can tell. But at the principle level, don'ts. Arrogance, right? Thinking that you know and others don't. Having no humility, that I don't think is good. Because even if you want to be aggressive and appear confident and portray that you are in control, that's what's happening at the surface. But inside, the arrogance cannot help you. The same is true of losing your cool, right? I said, don't lose your cool. Now, does that mean you shouldn't ever sound angry? That being angry might pay dividends? Yes, sometimes it does. But feeling angry doesn't do much for us. So being out of control, and not being able to keep your emotions in control, I would put that in the don't category. Will it always hurt you? No, it will not always hurt you, but it does not benefit you. So the more we can do to control those things. But again, there's a wide range of things once we start unpeeling this onion and sort of digging deeper into it, right? So getting as many perspectives from different people is a good thing. Making sure that you're mindful not just of the substance of the deal, but the framing. Be mindful of the psychology of the deal. How are they seeing you? What assumptions are they making of you? Yeah, always do that. Always be mindful of what frame is taking hold in this negotiation. So there's more we could probably say about it.
Yeah. So I think maybe in the do's, if I can add, it's like at least knowing what's your what you can accept. It's like sometimes you just walk away, lose sight of that, and you don't know what you can accept and what's the alternative, and you walk away not getting anything. And on the don'ts, if I remember correctly, try to avoid giving ultimatums, because that's just almost the end of.
Yeah, but again, but are there situations where I'll give an ultimatum? Yes, right? Are there situations where, and now, for example, if I know for a fact that this truly is a real ultimatum, and there's no gentler way of making it clear to them, sometimes you'll have to say, listen, this is a deal breaker for me. Because if they don't know it's a deal breaker for you, and it really is, they might end up doing things that lead to no deal, because they end up starting to sort of ignore that important aspect for you. So again, tactically, you might still do it sometimes, but in general, it's good to avoid, because when you make ultimatums, now we're getting at the level of the principles, well, we want to make sure that the other side doesn't lose face. We want to make sure that the other side doesn't lose their cool. We want to make sure that the relationship is good. You want to avoid ultimatums, but never, no, I wouldn't say never, because that's a tactic. And there's always some possibility that that's the best thing you can do in that moment.
All right. Okay. So you have written a couple of books, The Negotiating Genius. Oops, it's not showing. And Negotiating the Impossible. All right. And now it's your novel, The Peacemaker Code, which I've just finished last night, and it was a page turner. It's fun. It's quite different, and it's a lot of. But I'll let you talk about it. Whether is this to do? Is it more like an entertainment or education? And that's my second question. Rather, my first question would be like, what makes you decide to write a fiction novel?
So
how did you come up with it?
Yeah, so I'll talk briefly about it. So when I sent an email to, including to OPM 51, to the former students whose emails I still have, which is a number of you, I think I described it as this might be the best book I ever write, which is, I do feel that way. At the same time, it's a strange admission to make, because my job as an academic and as a scholar of negotiation and as an educator and as an advisor is to talk about nonfiction, right? So my trade is not to write a fiction book. So if this is the best book I end up writing, I'll be very proud of it, but it feels a little bit weird. What happened is this past year, I went on sabbatical. And right before I went on sabbatical, two things happened. One, I had just launched a new course called War and Peace. And the course, the full title is a little bit lengthy, and it's a little bit, maybe it doesn't show enough humility, but War and Peace, the Lessons of History for Leadership Strategy, Negotiation, Policy, and Humanity. So I launched this course at Harvard Business School for the MBAs. It's about looking back to 2,500 years of human history where we've tried to wage wars, prevent wars, end wars, win wars. What are the lessons for strategy, leadership, and negotiation? So I'd made this course. I'd written it basically from scratch, this course. And it was one of the most exhausting things I've ever done as an academic, to build this course and to teach it for the first time. I had just finished it, and my plan for the following year was to write a nonfiction book on war and peace and the lessons for strategy and negotiation and leadership. And what are the lessons human beings should learn from our history of all this devastation that we've been a part of? But then the COVID pandemic happened, and it wasn't quite clear how things were going to unfold. But one of the things it did was, much sooner than I expected, I had time to sort of start focusing on writing. But I was so exhausted from that course that I was like, I'll do it in a month or so. I want to give myself a month to sort of think about how that book should be written. And then a completely random event took place. The last meeting I had in my office right before the pandemic struck was with a guy who I'm an advisor to. I'm on his board. And he randomly makes this comment about what your next book should be about. He says, you know what your next book should be about? And he drops this idea of a fiction sort of novel. And I kind of laughed it off. And I thought, that's kind of interesting, but I wouldn't write a fiction book. But for the next month, I could not get this idea out of my mind. It was just like a kernel of an idea. It was just sort of like a seedling. But it started growing and growing and growing. And over the next 4 weeks, I had all these images of like how the story would unturn, but it had aspects of strategy, negotiation, war and peace, history, and then in a seemingly compelling narrative. So about 4 weeks later, I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't keep thinking about it. I had to start writing. So end of April last year, so just over a year ago, I started writing this thing. And I wrote for 3 months straight, like every night, just for hours. And by the end of July, I had a first full draft of this book. And along the way, some friends and family and colleagues were reading it. So they were I'd give them whatever I'd written so far, and they were getting really into it as well. So next thing I know, I've written this book, and it is all of the things that I think I find interesting intellectually on strategy, negotiation, dealing with difficult situations, sort of the ultimate conflict, the no-win situation. How would you deal with that? That just seems like there's no way out. So there's aspects of that in it. There's aspects that are very educational in it. But to your second question, I decided about a fourth of the way as I was writing this book that I would make sure I would never sacrifice entertainment value for education value. So although every other book I ever write prioritizes education above all else, in the classroom, I will educate you. If that means entertain you, I'll try to entertain you. If that means make you do work you hate, I'll make you do work you hate. Because the goal is I want to educate you, and I'll do whatever it takes to get to that goal based on whatever my abilities might be. In this book, I gave myself the complete freedom to say, there will be a lot of interesting insights. I can already see that, but I will try to entertain and make a page turner and make it something that once people get into it, they're like, wow, this is really fun. And I think I hope, the reviews have been really good, but I hope that that's what it does for people, that they walk in because they're curious, they're interested, they want to be entertained, and they enjoy it. But along the way, a lot of people that read it will say, my God, halfway through, I started just taking notes, or I underlined a lot of stuff, or I have a lot of folds in my book because I didn't expect it to also have this other aspect. So that's how I think about it.
So who should read this book? Don't say everybody in this room, because the fact that they're in this room is already like they're already aspiring for knowledge, that
Sure.
interact and everything. But who else outside of, say, who joined the seminar today, who would be your target audience?
So it's interesting because you're right. Your gut instinct is right that as an author, it's very easy to want to say, oh, everybody should read my book. But it's actually one of the things that publishers will often ask you when you write a book, which is like, who should read your book? And they hate the answer, everybody should read it, because that just means you haven't thought about who your audience should be. Anybody who enjoys fiction, fast-paced fiction, sort of page-turnery kind of fiction, or sci-fi. There's elements of sci-fi in this, I think is a sort of a natural audience. So when the book had to go on Amazon, you need to put a category for it. So that's where you're sort of forced to pick like 2 categories. And it's hard not to put this book into sort of fiction, sci-fi, mystery, suspense genres, because that's what anybody who doesn't know who I am, who just thinks of it as a fiction book, will categorize it as. But one of the more interesting sort of descriptions of the book that somebody gave a while ago, or I'll give you maybe two, but one of them was the book is sort of like, and again, maybe the people in the room have or have not read some of these books, but it's sort of like the Da Vinci Code meets Ender's Game meets Sapiens is how somebody described it, which it's kind of interesting. So the Da Vinci Code is basically this guy who's trying to solve all these mysteries and puzzles and try to solve this big mystery. Ender's Game is a bit of a sci-fi. It is a sci-fi book about dealing with this really unwinnable situation. And then Sapiens is a nonfiction book about, the nature of humanity itself and who are we and how do we become who we are. And so if you like, so there was a review done by Book Life, which is part of Publishers Weekly. They had these two interesting lines in it. It said, the main character is a mix of Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock Holmes, everybody I think knows, Robert Langdon, who's the protagonist in the Da Vinci Code, and Captain Picard, who's like from Star Trek: The Next Generation. And they said it's a book for somebody who likes a little bit more depth in their sort of conflicts, War of the Worlds kind of scenarios. So I guess I would lean on those two things. I think if you like fiction, sci-fi, mystery, suspense, I think that's an important hook. But then if you like to really have books that make you think and teach you something about strategy, negotiation, war and peace history, dealing with situations that seem unwinnable, well, then there's a lot of treats for you is the hope.
Yeah, and there's a lot of historical references, like turning points in history, what people did and what certain characters did. It's very interesting, but I'm not allowed to say much, otherwise it's going to be a spoiler.
No spoilers is the only thing we agreed would be the rule.
Sorry to forget. Let's get a bit to a personal question then. What did you learn from writing your first fiction ever?
What did I learn? So I enjoyed writing this book more than almost anything I've done as an academic. And it doesn't, and I think the book is, honestly, I think the book is good. And the reviews have sort of helped me feel that way. But it doesn't necessarily mean I think I could do it again. I look back to those 3 months and it feels like a dream. It feels like I was in this reverie where I was just in the zone. I was living with these characters. I got to know them. I was transported into a world. And that does not happen when you write nonfiction, I assure you. The other thing is that, I have re-anchored myself as, I think, an educator a little bit because of this. So I started out by saying that I decided to entertain rather than educate. But because so many people feel like it was such an educational experience for them, I'm stuck rethinking like how I approach even a regular book I might write. And so when I had originally wanted to write a book on history of war and peace, and I had a vision of what that book should look like. But honestly, the vision I had was the kind of book that most people, when they buy, it'll sit on their shelf and they probably won't end up reading it. It'll be like this thick and it'll be like, oh my God, what an impressive book. But are people actually going to go through the whole book? Maybe not, because it doesn't have that quality of just like sucking you in unless you're the right amount nerdy and interested in that topic. So I think what it's done for me is it's re-taught me something that I thought, it's taught me something that I thought I knew, which is how much the audience matters and how what you should really do. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to write another fiction. I won't make it fiction. It'll be nonfiction. But the length of it, how short the chapters are, how gripping it is, how you bring in that enjoyment as you go through, I think that's going to be much more important. And I'm sort of curious to see how it changes a little bit more of how I approach even teaching, right? In fact, a lot of my colleagues that have read it, they think I should use the book in the class, actually. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens. But that's kind of how I think about it. It was sort of an enlightening experience.
Someone in the audience already called it an educated entertainment, at some so that's one thing that popped up and I saw. But I can't believe it. Time went by so fast, and we're almost into the Q. We actually should be in the Q&A now.
Oh,
But
yes,
before we
absolutely.
go to
Yes,
Q&A,
let's.
but before that, you have so much to share, right? And some might want to learn more from you. So you've written books, you have video online, you teach courses person online. What is the best way to teach people about negotiation? We get to that, and then we get to the Q&A.
So, the other thing I did during the pandemic was I ended up creating these like short videos. I mentioned the Zoom video, the video on negotiating on Zoom. It was actually one of the 40 videos I posted last April. So before I ended up starting to write this book, before I got sucked into the Peacemakers Code, I decided, just because we were locked down anyway, I would just create short videos that I would post for free. And the reason I mentioned that is, if the question is, how can I best learn? I came to the conclusion that very few people, relatively speaking, will ever walk into a classroom with me. And I might feel like, hey, the best way to learn is always with, a lot of time spent in a sort of teacher-student relationship in a classroom, or people will have me do trainings and for their team or for their company. So I do that even now. But not everybody can afford to come to a class at HBS, and not every company or leader can afford to bring me into their company. So I wanted to create as many things as I could that people could more cheaply do, right? So the books are a lot cheaper. Are they the same experience as being in the classroom? No, of course not. But there's a lot of stuff in the books at a certain price point. The videos are free. My hope is to make as many things free as possible. So even when I wrote this book, like the Kindle, the ebook edition is only like $6-7, right? So it's about as cheap as I could make it. The book is another way of reaching a different audience. It's an audience that doesn't even want to learn about negotiation, but will end up learning about it. So the way I think about it is, pick your price point, pick your level of engagement and interest. And if all you want is to browse a couple of videos, I put up 40 free videos. Hopefully some of those will be of value to you. I want nothing out of it. I get nothing out of it, but hopefully it helps spread some knowledge. If you get more interested, there's books. If your company is interested, of course, then I would work with your company. But there are cheap options. There's free options. I would start with those.
All right, so let's get to some of the Q&A. I'm not sure you want to get to this again, but I see this one question that says the challenges in the virtual world. I mean, negotiation and the challenges in the virtual world. Do you want to touch more on this, or you think I've covered enough?
Yeah, I think let's get some other ones, and then we'll come back to that one if it feels like we have time, just so we don't.
Here's one challenge. What if the other side don't want to build trust or share information?
Yeah, that's fine. I can respect that. But again, why don't they is the question, right? If they think for them to achieve their objectives, they don't need to build trust or share information, how can you blame them? They shouldn't build trust or share information if they can achieve their objectives without doing so. So what you have to kind of figure out is their model may be wrong? Might they be better off? Is there any incentive for them to share information? And I think you're in one of two states of the world. Either you're in a completely zero-sum game, you're just going to haggle over price or some one issue, in which case neither you nor they really are going to benefit from too much building of trust or sharing information. And the fact that they're not doing it should not be a surprise to you. And you probably aren't sharing information either, and you're just annoyed that they're not giving you what you want. That's fine. You're going to have to haggle it out. The more interesting version of this question is when the other person is doing these things, but it's actually going to destroy value in the deal. It's going to probably hurt both sides. And there, what an effective negotiator will do is two things. One, in various ways, you have to educate the other side about the benefits of doing this. If you can share this with me, I might be able to be more flexible here, right? That kind of thing creates a little bit of education and incentive. The second thing is something that I tell my students. If you walk into a class of mine, it's not unlikely that you heard me at some point say, listen, you walking into a negotiation class at Harvard Business School does not make the rest of the world a nicer place, an easier place, a better place. The people you're going to be negotiating with have not changed just because you took a few weeks off and went to a course or you got your MBA or something. They're going to be the same people with the same behaviors and the same approach. The question is, have you learned something that allows you to deal with the same person who's maybe being just as non-sharing or just as aggressive and just as untrustworthy as they were before? And I think the answer is yes. So for example, I think making sure that you focus on process, not just on the substance of the deal, is important. They may not know that, but you can propose that. They may always focus on things like negotiating one issue at a time rather than negotiating the entire deal, but you can change that process and sort of make offers where you're negotiating multiple issues, which is something we teach. They might not be justifying their offers, but when you justify yours, it can help. They might be making ultimatums, but if you know how to deal with ultimatums, well, now you're in a better place. So I think most of what we teach actually presumes you're going to be dealing with someone who hasn't taken the same course as you. Otherwise, it would be a very small market that we'd be teaching, right? We can't teach stuff that only works if the other side is as sophisticated, quote unquote, as you are. So I think I take that as a given. In fact, that's what I look forward to. I look forward to, and maybe it's because that's usually where I get brought in. We're dealing with people who aren't doing these things. How do we move forward with that?
Right. I get this. The question that mattered the most in negotiation, is there one, or actually?
The question that matters most. The question that matters most in negotiation, if there is an answer to that, because it depends on the negotiation. But the question is definitely why, as in WHY. Too often negotiators are stuck going back and forth on what. What do they want? What do I want? What do I want? Here's what I want. What do you want? But I can't give you what you want. Effective negotiators move the conversation from what to why, or as some people say, you move the conversation from the positions people have, like what they want, to their underlying interests, what's driving them. Because what you want and what I want might be incompatible. We can't both get what we want because you want A and I want B. And we have to. But once we understand what's driving you and why you want A, there might be ways for me to solve that problem for you, making you flexible enough that you can get me B, or vice versa. You know, I give you A in exchange for something else that solves my problem, which is why I wanted B. So moving conversations from what to why, understanding why. Now, that doesn't mean just because you ask the question, people will tell you why. Sometimes they don't trust you. Well, why do you need this? Well, if they tell you why they need this, you might be able to take advantage of them. Maybe they'll come across as desperate. So just asking the question why doesn't always give you the answer. The question is the most important, but how you get to the answer sometimes isn't just by asking, using that one word, it's by triangulating on it, building a bridge towards the answer process so that you can deal with their
maybe from the manufacturing sector, all that customer want is the lowest price, and it's impossible to meet it. How do you negotiate in this scenario?
Well, so again, if truly all they want is the lowest price, well, you can't blame somebody who wants the lowest price. I suspect you want the highest price. So that seems totally fair. If you literally can't meet it, well, then you move on and that's not your customer. So that's the end of that negotiation. Not every negotiation has to end in a deal. But let's unpack it a little bit, right? What you need to try to figure out is the answer to questions like, are they saying they need it to be this low? But that's just because they're trying to get you as low as possible, but really they could accept something a little bit higher. Okay, so how do we play that game? Are they saying that the only thing that matters is price? But really they care about other things as well, but they just are focusing only on price because that's what they're wanting to convince you to lower. But they actually do care about things like quality. They do care about the reputation of their supplier, et cetera. So if that's the world you're in, right, which is different, which is, okay, price isn't the only thing that matters. Other things matter. They're just not admitting that other things matter. Well, then you play a slightly different game. Now, which game you play varies. But for example, sometimes we'll propose or we'll advise people, make multiple offers. Give them a low price option and a high price option. You don't have to argue with them how much price matters. But if the high price option comes with more goodies that you think they should value, then they're more likely to move in that direction. A third option might be that the process is what's messed up, right? So you're coming in at a point in the process where they're still going to shop around. So all they're doing when they ask you for the lowest price, they're not even planning on doing the deal right now anyway. They're going to still shop it around. So as a negotiator, your job is to figure out which of these worlds am I really existing in? Am I in a world where I care about high price, they care about low price, and it's going to be a haggle? Yes, well, we have certain tools for that. But if you literally can't meet their price, then they're not your customer. Are you in a world where price is one of the things that matters? Other things also matter, but they're not admitting it. Are you in a world where they're not yet ready to commit to a certain deal? And depending on which one you're in, you play differently, right? So, but yes, there are situations where all it's going to be is a haggle. And if nobody's willing to buy your product because it's too expensive, and you have no way of showing other people that your product is better than your competitors, you don't actually have a negotiation problem. So this might be a good answer too. If truly the only thing that matters is price, and your price is higher than your competitors, and you have no other value add that's of value to the other side, you're probably in the wrong business. You have a strategy problem, not a negotiation problem. You need to be thinking about who would actually value the things you bring to the table, or you need to find a way to lower your price.
Okay.
People shouldn't
So I
pay you
think
more for this.
Yeah, we're going to go over for about 5 minutes, but prior to that, we may have to attend to about 2 or 3 questions and maybe about 1 minute each on each
Okay.
question. I have to read
Rapid
this one out. What do you see is the cross-cutting problem or pitfall in your research of past wars and peace, and what would you have done differently to change the outcome?
So cross-cutting pitfall. Okay, so I'll take one stab at it, because you said, okay, well, we're talking about all of history and we have 1 minute to answer what's the cross-cutting problem. So I'll give you a cross-cutting problem. A cross-cutting problem, in my sort of understanding of the situation, is that too often people use analogies from past experiences without those analogies being properly fitted to the current situation. So for example, if your model of regime change is what the US did after World War II, when they went into Japan or Germany, and you think that was a success, well, you're more likely as a US government to invade Iraq or Afghanistan and try to change the regime. But if your model of regime change, if the analogy that comes to your mind is Vietnam, well, you're maybe less likely to go into it. So which analogy is right? Or if you think of being overly aggressive as a bad thing because it led to World War I, you might not be aggressive enough and end up causing World War II. So what ends up happening is too often our leaders, policymakers, and citizens, we don't have enough breadth and depth of knowledge of history. So what we're doing is we're copying and pasting things that worked last time a little bit blindly. Or we're not doing things simply because they didn't work last time, even though this situation is different. And so I think a lot of the mistakes people have made, or what we can at least in retrospect think of as mistakes or ineffective, are because we end up copying and pasting based on previous outcomes, rather than truly understanding what makes the situations different and why things succeeded or failed in the past.
By the way, a lot of that is in your novel as well. Maybe this is an Asia perspective. I see a question of how, like, a younger brother negotiates with more like an elder brother, kind of like, if I put it that way.
Do you mean that figuratively, or you mean like literally with your older brother?
No, literally. In business,
Okay.
in family dispute, how does the lower power younger brother negotiate with the elder power who has usurped all the money and power?
I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, so okay. And as the younger brother in my relationship with my older brother, I can tell you that when we were younger, if it came down to who can beat up the other one, he would win. So I can appreciate the conversation. What you need to sometimes think about is what's driving this person. And yes, money is obviously sometimes what you're arguing over, or control is what you're arguing over. But sometimes in those relationships, because you didn't say, the question wasn't simply, what do you do with somebody who has more power than you? It was very specifically about older brother. And to me, often what that shows is that sometimes the underlying dynamic is about self-identity and respect and reputation and how you're perceived. And so what you might think you're negotiating and what they think is being negotiated sometimes are two different things. What's sort of making you angry, anxious, upset in that relationship because you don't think you're being treated fairly, let's say as a younger person in that. And I'm sort of thinking of business context mostly, right? So people often have this sort of issue. You might be asking for more or equality. And the older person is thinking, wait a second, how can it be equal when I've done so much more, or I'm older, or how will I look if it becomes equal, or if you're more successful? So there's all these sorts of other things going on. And so sometimes the only way to get what you want is to make sure you are appreciating the things that are really standing in the way of them saying yes. It may not be the money. It may be the identity. It may, it's sort of, and parent-child, this happens too. The child who goes into the parent's business, right, the family business, and sort of feels like, you know what? They treat me like I'm still 15 years old. I'm now 50 years old. And it's still, I have to get approval for everything. I don't, and none of my decisions really matter. I've been given the title of CEO or president, but I have no real control. Often what's going on is, from the parent's perspective, yeah, maybe they don't trust you, but often what's happened is, you've got your own life now, and you don't call as much as you used to call, and you have your own kids now, and the parent is not necessarily as involved. They used to be the patriarch of everything, business, family, everything. And now they're less and less needed in all of these roles. And so sometimes the person might be holding on for identity reasons and emotional reasons. So if you ignore those, or think, well, that's ridiculous, or that's irrational, we're talking about business here, you're doing yourself a disfavor. So I think understanding people for who they are in the entirety and what drives them sometimes gives you the clues you need for how to move forward with this. And it won't be an aha moment. It may be an aha moment, but it won't be an aha solution. The day you sort of figure out what's really going on here doesn't mean you'll solve it that day. You'll still need to then lay the foundation and ask yourself, okay, here's where we are. It sucks. Here's my theory of the case. Here's why maybe this is happening. What do I need to do over the next 3 months, 6 months, year, or 2 years, so that by that time we can have a better conversation about this and solve this problem?
I'm glad that question was asked. I think it helps a lot with the family dynamics in Asia. Very short answer to the next question, which is the last one. And I'm sorry, I can't go over to all the question. Will you write a sequel or a prequel?
I won't write a prequel. I don't get this whole prequel thing, but they're just never interesting to me for some reason. But sequel. So the book ends, and Ricky, you've read it. The Peacemakers Code ends, I think, with a lot of good closure. But it certainly leaves the opportunity to write more on these characters and what might happen next. And the character could continue that story. There could be other stories. I am going to, when I finished it, that if I never wrote more on this, I'd be happy, and I am. And I said to myself, if the reviews are great and if enough people read it, I would definitely consider writing a sequel, because I loved spending time with these characters. I just loved being with them. So the reviews so far have been fantastic. So that checked that box. Now it's a matter of how much of an audience there is. And if the audience grows enough that there'd be enough people who would read a second book, well, then I would definitely consider it. But I am not sitting here thinking about that second book. I'm thinking about the problems that are happening in the world, the people that I'm working with, students, and maybe the other book I want to write next. Yeah.
So any parting thoughts before we switch back to our president for the wrap up?
Just first, again, gratitude for all of you who took your time out. It's always a roll of a dice. Is this going to be worth my time or not? And there's a lot of Zoom events happening and other events happening these days. So I appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully, if you do check out the Peacemakers Code, I would love reactions. I always welcome them. Any reactions, all reactions are always welcome. And hopefully, if you either read the book or because of this session, if you got some ideas that are of value to you, then I am very, very happy that we spent the time together.
Thank you very much, Deepak. And over to you, Kun Bantun, for the wrap up of this
That is
session.
very nice. Thank you very much. I'm sure the members of the audience will take away from the professor's presentation what is beneficial to their conduct of their affairs in the future. I certainly remember the professor's point on the imperative of safeguarding one's credibility, the necessity to fix the mistake to regain that credibility. I find that very instructional and reaffirming, and also the undesirability of being too arrogant. On behalf of the participants in the webinar tonight, and on behalf of the Harvard Association of Thailand, I'd like to thank Professor Deepak Malhotra for his most enlightening presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kun Janisa, for your introduction of the professor, and thank you, Ricky, for you being a part of the conversation with the professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Bentun.